In this segment, we're going to look at three important aspects of image making: process, generation, and iteration. And these are much less about your skills as an image maker or as a designer, and much more about how can you develop some strategies to be productive and generate a lot of material when you're making images. So let's first of all look at process. Process is how you make images, the steps that you take in order to make them. So rather than thinking about image making as a very literal, direct process where you have a clear idea of what the image should be and then you make exactly that image, process-driven image making really lets you experiment along the way, quite often without an idea of what the final outcome is going to be. So for instance, we might have an idea of a process for making this image, which is to cut an apple in half, to put some different colored paint onto that apple, and then make a print using the apple itself as the object that we're printing with. Now we might have a fairly clear idea about what this image might come out like, but we couldn't possibly predict exactly what the image might look like in all its details. And if we start to add more steps to our process, so here for instance is the image overprinted a couple of times, we actually start to get even more interesting results. And there's no real way that you could have visualized these results in the first place. You could have had a rough idea of what you think is going to happen or how you might want the image to feel, but the exact details are really down to the process itself. So here's another example where the designer made the shape of an apple out of some pieces of cardboard and then used those pieces of cardboard as a plate to make an image from by either coloring the image in or by rubbing over the image. And while the shape of the image might be quite predictable, the haloing and the texture really is less predictable and comes out of the process, it comes out of the making. And you can see that's accentuated even further when you start to have multiples of this image and have them interact together, where suddenly the negative space and the texture is even more accentuated than before. And one thing that's great about process-driven work is that you can use it as a way to make a number of images. You can make the images as the process progresses. So for instance, here's a woodcut where you can see it's an apple core, and then here's a later version of the woodcut where there's even more cut away. And so by making different prints at different times in the process, you start to get a range of images, and then you can go back and look at them and pick which one you really want to use. Iteration is your friend in any kind of image making, and what iteration means is just that you make a lot of variations of the same thing. You don't just make one image and be done. You actually redraw the same image, try and remake it, rework it, make slightly different versions of it. And what this is allowing you to do is to really test drive your images so that you make them and you look at them and you can assess which ones are working and which ones aren't. And sometimes the easiest way to do that is really to look at the image and say, well, is this one better than this one? And you have to have two comparative images in order to make that kind of decision. And part of what iteration boils down to is the fact that you don't always get it right first time, so it's useful to have many opportunities at making the same image over and over again. Just think about it like takes in a movie, or recording a song and having to record little pieces of it over and over again. Sometimes you have to do the thing 2 or 3 times in order to get it just right. One of the great things about iterative image making is that every time you make that image, you're actually practicing and you're really increasing your image making skills. So it's a really good way of mastering a certain technique because you're forcing yourself to really participate in that technique over and over again. The third aspect of image making that we're going to look at briefly is generation. What we mean by this is just making as many objects as you can, just trying to continually make and to learn from that making as a continual process. So don't get put off if you get stuck or if you're having a hard time with anything. Just move on and try a different technique or a different way of working. Part of this is about acknowledging that there's no single correct way to make this image. We're really looking at you to try and be inventive, try and experiment, and try and gather a really broad range of skills, and then be able to apply those skills later on to a number of different projects.